Professor Thorallur Aldursson is a professor at the Faculty of Food Science and Nutrition at the University of Iceland. He also holds an external position as senior scientist at the Department of Epidemiology Research at State and Serum Institute in Copenhagen. His main research activities are within nutritional and environmental epidemiology, covering both observational studies and human interventions. He is a member of the committee revising the 2022 Nordic Nutrition Recommendations on the Nordic Council of Ministers, and he has since 2015 been a member of the European Food Safety Authority Scientific Committee. So please, Professor Aldursson, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Do I control the slides or do you control the slides? I'm trying to figure out. Okay, I'm trying to go back and it's not working, so. The right button at the center. Right mouse button, okay. Yeah, okay, and then, yeah, okay. So thank you very much. So I'm here, we are two here talking about assessing risk and benefits of novel foods. I will be talking about the basic principle, which will mostly be focused on anything except novel foods, but I will try to pull in the novel food perspective, and the next speaker will give a more comprehensive example on risk-benefit assessment of novel foods. See, this is, I'm trying to, yeah, and I mean, there are many definitions of risk-benefit assessment, but I mean, the obvious one is simply that when it comes to foods, we are trying to weigh risks and benefits of consuming, you know, individual foods, the risk benefits of different diets, and we can go down to nutrient level for that matter. And this is basically what we try to assess when it comes to risk benefits. I mean, I think what we are seeing, at least in my environment here in Iceland, and I think we are seeing it in other European countries as well, is that the dietary habits are becoming more diverse. We have more and more people following strict vegan diets, flexible sort of vegetarian diets, ketogenic diets, fasting, and so on. And I think the amount of nutritionally enriched food products is becoming more prevalent, and I think novel foods will become in the future as well. And this kind of highlights the need for assessing whole diets rather than individual foods. But assessing the risk and benefit of individual foods is of course more common, but in the background, regardless of whether it's diet or individual foods, we have the nutrients, and they are sort of the key pillar of any nutrient risk benefit assessment. Let me see, yeah. And when it comes to different diets, I think the whole thing is that, you know, it's really important from a public health point of view to assess the risks and benefits of different diets, because for example, if we look at vegan diets, we can see that their longevity, their body composition, and there are many favorable attributes of that type of diet, but there are nutritional risks. But this is well beyond sort of the safety of a certain product. This is more like a public health type of initiative. When it comes to different foods, which would be more relevant when it comes to novel foods, I think the key issue to consider is that when we do risk benefits with individual foods, it is important to define the comparator, because we cannot increase our consumption of a certain food without decreasing our consumption of another food or different foods. And how we define that comparator is basically deriving the whole risk-benefit assessment. And I think the outcome of a risk-benefit assessment is highly population-dependent in many cases, simply because across many different European countries and other countries, we eat quite differently on a local level. Now, when it comes to nutrients, I think the risk-benefit assessment on nutrients, even though you won't find it in published literature, I think most public health authorities have done risk-benefit assessment before they decided to fortify foods, regardless whether it's iodine in salt, vitamin D in fats and oils, as we have in Finland, or folic acid in wheat flour, as we have in the US. And of course, before we advocate any supplemental intake as a general recommendation, a modest risk-benefit analysis is usually most appropriate. And the issue is a little bit that in the EFSA guidance from 2010, I mean, the overall framework for deciding, sort of assessing risks and benefits is relatively straightforward. We simply you do the risk characterization separately from the benefit characterization. There's an exposure assessment where we compare the two. And then the final step, which is unique for any risk-benefit assessment, is the risk-benefit comparison. And this is actually the problematic part, maybe because we, from a public health point of view or within EFSA remits, we characterize risks and benefits quite differently. And I will come to that and spend a little bit of time on that. There has been a lot of development since the EFSA guidance, and there's a lot of really good papers providing a framework for risk-benefit assessment decision trees, and the next speaker has actually been working quite a lot on that and is more at home in that field. And I think this has been moved the field very much forward. But I think at the end of the day, still, we are in a position where, despite these frameworks, the key overarching issues is how we define risks and benefits when we do our risk-benefit assessment, and that is going to drive the outcome of any assessment. And we can do this in many ways. We can define risks and benefits. For example, when it comes to benefits, we have dietary reference values, which are set by public health authorities, and when it comes to risk, we have health-based guidance values. And the level of acceptance or robustness of these values is relatively high, simply because they are derived by a group of experts analyzing the whole body of the evidence, and they tend to have a relatively high level of acceptance. We could, of course, do a systematic review or rely on systematic literature reviews, and that's very valid when it comes to both risks and benefits. And in some risk-benefit assessment, we do our own literature research or expert judgment, and that is also quite valid at times, but it's like we need to check the fundament of any assessment and be aware of what we are doing and what we are not doing. And coming myself from nutrition and working with assessing chemical risk, my presentation will be pretty much focused on chemical risk assessment and nutrient risk assessment rather than microbial risk assessment, which is probably more important at the end of the day than any chemical hazard, because the potency is much higher. But this will be the focus, and the next speaker will briefly address microbial risks. And when it comes to chemical risk and the guidance values that we provide, or health-based guidance values for flavoring, pesticide residues, contaminants, and unintended chemicals occurring through processing or food additives, it's more or less the sort of health-based guidance value. And by convention, they have been derived using experimental studies in rodents. And these models are pretty good at identifying possible adverse effects that may causally occur in humans. But the way they are derived from the simple fact that rodents are not humans, and the threshold for an effect in rodents and humans can be different, it can be the same, and the uncertainty factors that we use means that, whether the reference point or the health-based guidance value that we derive from an animal experiment, what risk it reflects in humans is anyone's guess. I think that's unfortunately it. We are eliminating risk rather than quantifying risk. But when it comes to human studies, the accuracy is, in my opinion, being an epidemiologist, much better, but it comes at the expense of uncertainty on causality. Of course, there is no free lunch. And if you just look at the normal health-based guidance value for a chemical, we are very conservative when we set it. We basically take the smallest biologically relevant increase that we see in a dose-response curve. We take the lower confidence interval on that, and we hammer it with an uncertainty factor of 100, meaning that the inflection point or the dose where the animals were starting to show a response, we are going well below that. And we set the health-based guidance value usually based on the most sensitive population in the most sensitive study. And if you think about it, for example, with methyl mercury, in that case it's based on human data, the health-based guidance value for methyl mercury is set on the basis of neurodevelopmental outcomes in infants. When it comes to dioxins, also human studies, but the rodent studies are more converging there pretty nicely. We set the health-based guidance value on reduced sperm count in men. And in both cases, it's only a part of the population during a certain period of time which is sensitive to this outcome, meaning that they are at risk, but the rest of the population is probably at risk at much, much higher levels. But when it comes to other chemicals like mycotoxins in cereals or OTA, we set it on the basis of cancer, which is probably relevant for everyone. So we minimize risk when it comes to risk. when it comes to benefits of food and nutrients, we are in a completely different ballgame, because all foods provide nutrients to a varying degree. We can have nutritionally poor foods and nutritionally rich foods, but all foods provide nutrients. And nutrients provide benefits when we are deficient, when we need them. Too high intakes are not associated with benefits. The only nutrient that I can think of that provides benefits well above the range that we normally consume would be folic acid for women of childbearing age. And as such, the balanced intake is usually what we aim for rather than any extreme intake. And when we look at the dose-response curve for nutrients, just to emphasize, what we strive is not to eliminate any, we eliminate risk here by risk of deficiency, but by providing a range for optimal intake. And below that optimal intake, let's say the recommended intake for vitamin D, that would correspond to a serum 25-hydroxy-D, a biomarker for vitamin D status of around 50 nanomoles or higher, up to 125 maybe. If we go slightly below that, there is no deficiency. If we have levels between 30 to 50 in our blood, it means that our body stores are not optimal, meaning that if we go into the winter, especially here in the north, with depleted body stores, you may be at risk of metabolic deficiency or symptoms later in the winter. And those symptoms would be like some minor disturbances in calcium homeostasis, but at a very, very low level, you would have clinical symptoms. And this is what the dose response curve for a nutrient looks like. We aim to minimize the risk of deficiency, but also at the same time avoiding excessive intakes. And in that case, for dietary reference value, we do have a direct correlation and quantifiable metric in terms of risk, because if you look at the graph to the left, if the intake distribution, my dietary survey shows that everyone is 2 standard deviations above the average requirement, if we have an estimate for that, or the recommended intake, there is no risk of nutritional deficiency, and there is no point in increasing the consumption any further in the population. However, if the monitoring data suggests that substantial part of the population is below an average requirement, we know that there are people at risk, and we would expect signs of this deficiency to occur in the population. And therefore, you have this correlation with benefits, I would say. Now, for further reading, I just left this paper here, an old paper if anyone is interested. But the other thing that I wanted to highlight is also that we tend to overemphasize, we overbelieve in individual foods, and this sort of overhype of, that we can produce high quality foods that have major benefits is a little bit misleading sometimes when it comes to risk-benefit assessment. And I think the best example that we have historically is the overbelief in the 90s that antioxidant supplementation would actually lead to reduced risk of cancer, simply because we saw that in observational setting that people who ate a lot of fruits and vegetables had lower incidence of cancer. The large randomized controlled trials that were conducted showed the opposite. You increase the risk of cancer because taking one nutrient out of a context of food is not necessarily leading to a benefit at all. And there is a very nice paper by the Nobel laureate Jim Watson, who was one of the 2 persons who got the Nobel Prize for discovery of the DNA helix. He wrote sort of one of his last papers that he wrote before retiring or being kicked out of academia, for a reason that you can find on Google. He wrote a quite interesting paper on his cancer research where the sentence is that the blueberries best be eaten because they taste good, not because their consumption will lead to less cancer. And I think it's good to have that in mind when we do risk-benefit assessment of individual foods. I think we can find the same parallel when we are looking at, for example, seafood. There are many different, benefits of certain foods, but we always tend to jump on a certain nutrient saying it must be the omega-3 fatty acid. But if you look at randomized controlled trials on omega fatty acids, the evidence is not very much compelling. If you look at the observational evidence for benefits on cardiovascular disease risk when you eat fish, the evidence is actually quite convincing, even though it's observational, simply because you're substituting one food with another, which may lead to benefits. Which is the final slide on these benefits, which you're probably getting tired of. I think in the European population, when we do risk-benefit assessment, the European population tends to be the nutrition status tends to be quite adequate, meaning that clinical signs of deficiencies are relatively rare, and in a well-nourished population, it's the balance of macronutrients, fibers, carbohydrates, which is probably more important, and that will be the final slide. Now, so where are we? This is the background in terms of risk-benefits. We assess risks and benefits differently, and this creates problems when we do risk-benefit assessment, in my opinion. Now, the next speaker made an excellent review paper here in 2015, where she compiled available evidence on available studies on risk-benefit assessment and characterized them. And you can see here by 2015, the majority of risk-benefit assessment conducted was on seafood, and about 70%, and about 70% in line with that was on chemical nutritional risk-benefit assessment. But some changes can be noted sort of as time progressed. And when it comes to use of qualitative or quantitative methods, majority of the studies were just doing simple comparison, meaning qualitative methods. There are quantitative methods, but most of the studies simple comparison. And that's because there are certain problems associated with quantitative methods, even though they're available. I know that you hear a lot that, quantitative methods are always better, but that is not necessarily the case. We need to be aware of the limitations, and sometimes a simple comparison is fully justified, I think, if we do it properly. But if you look at the EFSA guidance from 2010, there is basically overemphasis on conversion into a composite metric and compare the risks and benefit through the composite metric. And that is fine, but I think we are realizing we may need some more flexibility in our updated guidance. And the most sort of common composite metric is derived from the global burden of disease, where we can convert our health outcomes, meaning the risks and benefits, into a composite metric reflected by disability-adjusted life years measure, which is a measure where we actually put certain weights on certain diseases, and we combine or estimate the years sort of lived with disability plus years lost relative to expected life. And by using this approach, a quantitative approach, we can weigh together different diseases, whether it's risk or benefits, and come to a common conclusion whether the overall risk are higher than the overall benefits or vice versa. And this is quite a decent approach, but I think people need to be aware one of the limitations. It works very well when you compare daily adjusted life years between countries where the distribution of disease is quite different across socioeconomic status and other sort of hard drivers of disease. It also works very well at older age, where we actually see quite a lot of changes in quality of life. But when the margins are small, everything starts to break down, and that is maybe one issue with the DALYs and QALYs. The other is that we are comparing one adverse effect in one set of the population with a benefit in the other. But I think if you list down the limitations and are transparent about what this does and it does not, I think it's actually quite helpful to use the DALYs. If we take an example of a qualitative comparison on seafood here, it's from a study from Portugal. They basically just look at the nutrients relative to dietary reference values, and then look at the contaminants relative to some health-based guidance values and compare the two. The next speaker is going to give you a more extensive comparison on a quantitative approach. But what I want to end with, sort of 2 slides now and then I'm done, is that in terms of moving forward, we have realized that we need more options than the DALYs and the QALYs, even though they're excellent. We need maybe more structured approach when we are doing qualitative assessment. What we need today is also to be able to take into account multiple risks and multiple benefits, which was not in the previous EFSA guidance. And if you just look at seafood now, we have quite low health-based guidance values for perfluorinated compounds, which are quite high in seafood. We have new levels for health-based guidance value for dioxins. It went down by a factor of 7 recently in EFSA. We have mercury, and how can we assess all this in a combined risk-benefit assessment? I think you will see them quite a lot the same with other foods in the future, because I think what will be a key driver for future risk-benefit assessment is global warming and demand for more sustainable food production. We cannot simply allow ourselves to throw away food by eliminating any risk associated with food, because the number of people on the planet, combined with limited resources and rapid environmental changes, will simply make that not only unprofitable, but almost unethical. And I'm not saying we need to relax on chemical risk assessment or anything, but we need to adapt our methods. And I think here novel food may also play a role, and we are going to see rapid changes in the future. That's my prediction anyway. So in basic, we have well-established procedure for assessing risk and benefits. The risk-benefit assessment is complicated by the fact that we assess risks and benefits differently. And we may need to revise that probably in the future somehow. And as such, the comparison is often problematic. But I think, there are exciting times ahead, and global warming, changes in land use and resources will be a key driver how we assess risk and benefits in the future. Thank you.